In a vineyard in Georgia, a rusted tower stands among the grapevines. Its control panel hangs open. Farmers walk past it like a fence post. It's a rocket launcher. The Soviet Union ran the largest weather modification program on Earth. Rockets, radar, and aircraft built to punch holes in storms before they formed. It worked. Entire republics went decades without losing a harvest to hail. Then, the same technology protected a city from a nuclear cloud by pushing that cloud onto someone else. The machines are still standing. Why did an empire that could steer the sky let its machines rust? Start with the vines. This is Kakheti, eastern Georgia, wine country since before Rome existed, terraced hillsides that have grown grapes for roughly 8,000 years. In the 1960s, Soviet engineers looked at these fields and saw a problem that had nothing to do with politics. Hail. One storm could destroy an entire harvest in minutes, wiping out a season's income before a farmer even heard the thunder finish. So the state built a shield. Rocket launch towers went up across nearly 1.25 million hectares. Steel lattice frames rising out of vineyard rows like something dropped from a different decade. Radar dishes watched the sky for hail-bearing clouds, tracking pressure and moisture the way an air defense system tracks an incoming aircraft. When a threatening cell formed, crews fired rockets loaded with silver iodide straight into it, seeding the cloud so the ice fell as harmless rain instead of stones the size of a fist. It worked far better than most Cold War science ever admitted to working. Reports on the program describe damage reduced by anywhere from 20 to 95%, averaging somewhere around 75 to 85% effectiveness over 3 decades of operation. For a Soviet agricultural region, that number was almost unbelievable. Then, in 1989, the funding vanished. The union that built the system was collapsing faster than anyone could maintain a rocket network. Within a generation, hail damage in Kakheti climbed right back to where it had been before the towers ever went up. The system wasn't declared dead. It was simply left standing. Farmers kept working the vines underneath it, walking past silent launch towers the way you'd walk past an old telephone pole. In 2015, a scaled-down version came back online. Modern radar, rockets imported from Serbia, 80-some launch points instead of hundreds spread across the valley. But where the original service once employed more than 800 people around the clock during storm season, the revived one runs on about 30. Most of the old towers are still out there, unused, control cabinets rusted open, wiring stripped or left dangling, monuments to a war against the sky that the state simply stopped funding 1 year and never fully resumed. That network was built to fight nature on a farmer's timetable. The next one was built from a mountaintop, and it never stopped trying to understand the whole idea of controlling weather in the first place. High in the North Caucasus, near the slopes of Mount Elbrus, sits a research station that most people have never heard of. Clouds roll past the windows below eye level. Old instrument arrays are bolted directly into bare rock, weathered by wind that never really stops up here. This is where much of the actual science behind Soviet weather modification was developed. The physics of how ice crystals form inside a cloud, the exact chemistry of seeding agents, the methods later exported to rocket stations from the Caucasus all the way to Central Asia. Researchers here spent years studying storm cells, the way surgeons study anatomy, breaking them down layer by layer until the process could be repeated on command. This wasn't a single site protecting a single valley. It was the source code for an entire empire of weather control infrastructure, feeding techniques out to republics that had no idea a mountain laboratory was quietly authoring the program running over their heads. The Institute's exact current operations are harder to pin down with certainty. Some of its work is reported to continue in various forms, though its scope today isn't fully documented in public sources. What is clear is what it left behind. A blueprint that outlived the empire that funded it, scattered now across a dozen forgotten field stations from the mountains to the steppe. The mountain gave the program its science. A building outside Moscow gave it its brain. That building is the Central Aerological Observatory, founded in 1940 in the town of Dolgoprudny, just north of the capital. It doesn't look like much. A dated research campus, radio sonde launch pads, faded Soviet-era signage. But this was the central Soviet institution studying the physics of the atmosphere, and it built the scientific foundation not just for weather forecasting, but for weather modification itself. Not folklore. State science, funded and taken seriously at the highest levels for half a century. What began as pure atmospheric research, measuring pressure, humidity, and cloud structure at altitude using balloons, radio sondes, and later rockets, became the technical backbone for programs used in agriculture, aviation, and eventually something its founders in 1940 almost certainly never imagined: a tool for deciding, in a crisis, exactly where a cloud would let go of what it carried. Unlike almost everything else in this story, the observatory never fell into ruin. It still exists. It still does meteorological work in Russia today, its launch pads and instrument towers maintained rather than abandoned. It's the one facility here that never had to earn its survival, because the state never stopped needing it. Everything this observatory built was meant to protect people from the sky. In 1986, the same science was used to decide who the sky would fall on. On the 26th of April that year, Reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded, and for 2 days, the Soviet state said almost nothing, while the world outside started noticing radiation readings drifting over Sweden. Within 48 hours, Soviet meteorologists were tracking something worse than the fire itself: a radioactive plume, 10 miles wide, drifting northeast across Belarus on a hand-drawn map with an arrow pointed straight at a spring storm front stacking up over Moscow. If that cloud reached the capital and released its rain there, the exposure could have been catastrophic for millions of people living in the largest city in the Soviet Union. According to Soviet pilots who came forward decades later, the decision was to make it rain early and somewhere else. Silver iodide, the same chemical used to save Georgian vineyards from hail, was loaded onto artillery shells at a Moscow airport within hours. Air Force crews took off in two 16 bombers and flew the short hop toward the burning reactor, chasing the drifting cloud 30 kilometers out, then 70, then 200, firing seeding charges into it wherever they caught up with its edge. It was the same physics used on hailstorms, aimed now at a cloud carrying something far worse than ice. Villagers in southern Belarus reportedly watched strange yellow and gray contrails snake across the sky that afternoon with no idea what they were looking at. The next day, powerful winds picked up. Dark cumulus clouds billowed on the horizon, and heavy black rain fell over towns like Gomel and Mogilev, carrying radioactive dust down out of the air and into the fields, the wells, the gardens, and the soil that people would keep farming for years afterward. It worked, in the narrowest sense. Moscow was reportedly spared a direct hit, but the story remains disputed to this day. Officials in Moscow have consistently denied that any deliberate seeding operation ever took place over Belarus. What isn't disputed is that one of the pilots involved, identified years later as Major Alexei Grushin, was publicly honored for bravery on the 20th anniversary of the disaster. An award, he later said, was for flying cloud seeding missions during the cleanup, not for anything he'd been allowed to discuss at the time. Independent radiation surveys also show contamination levels in parts of Belarus disproportionately higher than the country's size and distance from the reactor would otherwise suggest, with some of the heaviest fallout landing well outside Ukraine's own borders. Whether the full account is exactly as those pilots described decades later, the pattern sitting in the data is hard to explain away with weather alone. The same rockets that had once protected a wine harvest had become, in someone's hands, an instrument for choosing which population would absorb a nuclear disaster. If one capital could be saved by pushing a radioactive cloud onto its neighbor's countryside, then, somewhere, someone had built the machines that made a decision like that even possible on this scale. Some of those machines are still standing, just not where anyone expects. Cross the border into Moldova, and you'll find the same rocket launch towers, the same cracked concrete pads, standing abandoned in open farmland under a very similar sky. Moldova ran its own dense stretch of the Soviet-wide hail suppression network, protecting its own agricultural belt with the same rockets, the same silver iodide, and the same centralized coordination that kept Georgia's vines safe for 30 years. When the Union dissolved in 1991, Moldova, among the poorest republics to emerge from the collapse, lost the centralized radar network, the shared rocket supply chain, and the funding that had made the whole system function as one continuous machine stretching across multiple republics. The stations didn't decline slowly. Many simply went dark almost overnight, mid-season, crews sent home with no announcement. Wildflowers now grow up through collapsed fencing around launch stands that once answered directly to a control room in Moscow. Some reports suggest later interest in reviving or purchasing updated systems, similar to Georgia's rebuilt network, though the current state of Moldova's original installations remains difficult to verify in detail from the outside. Moldova's stations went silent because the empire disappeared. Thousands of kilometers east, a whole mountain network went silent because the empire's money ran out somewhere else first. Follow the same program into the foothills of Central Asia, the mountain edges of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and the pattern repeats itself against a harsher, drier landscape. The USSR extended hail suppression infrastructure deep into these regions to protect cotton and fruit production that mattered economically to the entire Union, not just to the republics growing it. Isolated radar towers and rocket batteries were built on arid slopes, connected by dirt roads to barracks that housed the crews who ran them through the growing season. These stations depended entirely on centralized Soviet coordination and imported equipment shipped in from factories thousands of kilometers away. When the Union broke apart, several of the newly independent republics inherited hardware, with no independent supply chain to keep it running, and no local factory that could produce a replacement part. Exact station counts and current conditions are harder to confirm with precision this far from any major reporting, but the broad picture is consistent. Partially dismantled installations, equipment reportedly stripped for parts over the years, and only sporadic, localized efforts since to revive limited versions of the service. An entire climate defense system, broken not by nature, but by the disappearance of the empire that had built it. Out here, the machines went quiet because nobody could afford to keep them running. But back in the capital, one version of this exact same program never lost its funding at all. Look at Red Square on a major state occasion, a Victory Day parade, a national holiday, and you'll often see something unusual for Moscow's climate: a flawless blue sky over rows of marching soldiers in rolling armor. This isn't luck. Since the Soviet era, aircraft have reportedly been used to seed or disperse clouds ahead of major ceremonial events in the capital, keeping the skies clear for the cameras and the crowds standing along the parade route. It's a practice that has continued into the modern Russian state, applied on numerous documented occasions over the decades, separate from and far less secretive than what happened over Chernobyl. It doesn't need to hide. It's treated less like a wartime contingency and more like routine event planning, scheduled and budgeted the way you'd book a stage crew. And that's the real irony sitting underneath this entire story. While the rural hail defense empire was collapsing into unused towers and stripped down radar stations across 3 or 4 former Soviet republics, the version of the same technology that served the capital's image never missed a budget cycle. It didn't rust. It didn't lose its crews. It didn't wait 25 years for a partial revival. The empire that let its vineyards fend for themselves made absolutely sure its own skyline stayed clear. The empire didn't fail everywhere. It simply chose, deliberately and consistently, what was worth protecting. So picture it all together. A rusted rocket tower standing quiet among Georgian grapevines, its crew reduced from hundreds to a handful, its wiring hanging loose in the wind. Cracked concrete launch pads in a Moldovan field, wildflowers pushing up through the seams, waiting for orders that stopped coming more than 30 years ago. Grainy footage of dark, contaminated rain falling over villages in southern Belarus, while officials denied for decades that anyone had made it fall there on purpose. And somewhere above Moscow, on a clear and cloudless parade day, a seeding aircraft still climbing into an empty sky, doing exactly the job it was built to do, exactly on schedule, exactly as funded. These machines were never only about weather. They were physical proof of what a government decided was worth defending, and what or who could be left exposed to the storm instead. The empire could steer the sky. It simply never steered it evenly. Some of its instruments were maintained for half a century without interruption. Others were left standing in open fields the moment the money ran out, quietly rusting where the last crew walked away from them. And what's still standing out there, among the grapevines and the cracked concrete, is a record of exactly who this empire built its weather control machine to protect and who it never intended to protect at all.